cultural heritage. It's a connection to our past and a guide for our future. All over Alaska, Native people are becoming aware of the need to preserve and understand our past, to understand where we came from, who we are, and what we can become. Cultural heritage comes to us in many ways, in the words of our elders, our language, our customs and traditions. Science can help, especially the science of archaeology, the study of our past through objects that our ancestors left behind. Everything that people make and use, from their tools and clothing to their jewelry and their objects of worship, can tell us about their lives. These things may be lost or thrown away or simply laid aside, but they can provide a wealth of information to later generations that find them. Objects are important because very often the knowledge of older ways, particularly things that occurred in the distant past, gets lost. Objects can show us how people lived. They can give us a concrete feel for what life was like. Archaeology is a systematic way of learning about the past by recovering and studying the objects that earlier people made and used. An object or an artifact can be beautiful and interesting all by itself, but unless we know how to study it, it may not tell us much about the way of life that it represents. An archaeologist would want to know where the object came from, what materials it was made from, how it was made, who used it, and how it was used. An archaeologist would want to study that object in relation to other objects from the same place and the same time. Bill Fitzhugh, an archaeologist and curator at one of the nation's greatest museums, does just that.
They're stored according to implement type. In this case, you have snow goggles from a number of different locations and time periods from the 1880s up to the 1940s, perhaps, stored together. And this was done so that the collections that were of a similar size and shape could be conveniently stored in these units, rather than keeping all of Nelson's collection discrete and then Murdoch's collection discrete and so on. This would have multiplied the amount of space they needed. So they consolidated all of these things into types of implements. And that makes it easier to see across the Arctic the whole range of forms in Eskimo culture.
That's why objects from past times are carefully cataloged and placed in collections, so they can be studied, analyzed, and compared by scientists. These objects are available to anyone who wants to learn about the past. This is the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. It's a center for display and study of literally millions of objects from all over the world. In fact, it's the largest museum complex in the world, where scholars and members of the public can see and learn about almost every aspect of science. The Smithsonian is the home of the vast collection of artifacts made and used by the Eskimo people of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and the Bering Straits region. It was compiled by a young naturalist, Edward Nelson, who lived in the region from 1877 to 1881. Nelson worked as a weather observer at St. Michael, which was then a small trading post on the southern shore of Norton Sound. He spent his free time traveling through the region by boat and dog team, visiting the villages and learning about the Eskimo people and their ways. In those days, the people of the Delta and the Bering Sea coast lived much as Eskimos had always lived. That was in 1877, just 10 years after the United States had purchased the Alaska Territory from Russia. The people of the region had had very little contact with Europeans, except for an occasional trader, whaler, or missionary, and things like firearms and metal tools were still uncommon. One reason that Nelson's collection is so interesting and important to us is that it gives us one of the best glimpses of what life must have been like in the days before Eskimo culture was changed by contact with the Europeans. Bill Fitzhugh explains.
The Nelson collection is a whole comprehensive material culture of a group. It was Nelson's purpose in going to Alaska to obtain an example, at least one, of virtually everything that he saw people using, and thereby to represent this culture in a museum context, and then make it available to do things we're doing, such as reconstructing it in a museum exhibit. In a sense, well, Nelson's collection is probably the best collection for archaeologists to use in understanding prehistoric cultures as well, Eskimo cultures particularly, because it is so complete and because it includes so many of the kinds of systems, the harpoon systems, the knives, the containers, and things that archaeologists frequently find in the ground.
Nelson was lucky, and so are we, because he made his collection before the spread of Christianity put an end to many traditional Eskimo practices and beliefs. In fact, just 20 years after Nelson's visit, the gold rushes in the Klondike and at Nome brought thousands of newcomers and changed the way of life forever. Nelson recognized the importance of his opportunity. The Smithsonian Institution was deeply interested in learning and preserving knowledge about the native people of the North. The officials at the Smithsonian got young Nelson his job with the U.S. Signal Corps and appointed him to learn and collect as much as he could. Nelson's specialty was ornithology, the study of birds, but he was a keen observer and the sort of man who could view the people of a totally different culture without prejudice and preconceived ideas. During his 4 years in Alaska, Nelson made a number of long trips, sometimes for months at a time, in western Alaska and Siberia.
And you can appreciate the problems in transporting such a piece on a dog sled through the middle of winter over maybe 1,000 miles of rough country, and then shipping it back to the Smithsonian, and here it is with most of its feathers intact, and 100 years later.
Nelson made extensive notes about the language, life, and culture of the people that he met. He traded tobacco, cloth, ammunition, needles, and beads for Eskimo tools and equipment, and because he particularly wanted old objects, he was jokingly known as Jaunrilngornik Kibbutz Dooley, the buyer of good-for-nothing things. In this way, Nelson gathered almost 10,000 Eskimo objects, ranging from tiny bone needles to a full-size kayak. As he collected each object, he asked the people how it was made and used, and he took extensive notes. He also took photographs as he traveled, using a large and clumsy camera that must have been difficult to operate, especially in cold weather. Each year, Nelson carefully labeled the objects, packed them into boxes, and shipped them to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. In 1899, he published a book about the people of the region called The Eskimo About the Bering Strait. That book is still available in many libraries, and it is considered to be one of the best descriptions of traditional Eskimo life. Nelson's book described many of the objects that he collected and explained how they were used. He also talked about the homes of the people, the languages, celebrations, and religious ceremonies that he observed. Strictly speaking, Nelson wasn't working as an archaeologist when he assembled his collection because most of the objects he gathered were not old. They were part of an active culture. Today, however, Nelson's collection is of great interest to archaeologists. Even though many aspects of the Eskimo culture have changed, the old ways still live for us in the objects that Nelson saved.
There are pail handles or box handles like this that you can trace back for 2,000 years. But in an archaeological site, you never find the box. You just find the handle because it happened to be made out of something that wouldn't perish so easily. The technology is really ingenious for these pieces. We sort of use a phrase now, Eskimo technology, or an Eskimo repair. It means a really good, simple repair. It's strong and often quite beautiful.
Archaeologists, like all scientists, work to increase our store of knowledge about the world. They study objects and then publish their results in articles and books that are available to the general public. One of the most important ways to bring this information to the public is through exhibitions of artifacts. For almost a year, Bill Fitzhugh and Susan Kaplan sorted through the thousands of objects stored in the Smithsonian attic, picking out pieces that they felt would best represent the culture that Nelson saw. They assembled over 500 of these artifacts into an exhibition to be shown at the Smithsonian. In addition, a smaller display will be shown at other locations, including many Alaskan communities. For the first time, many people have been provided with an opportunity to get a glimpse of the richness and variety of Eskimo culture. The museum display includes beautiful artwork and complex, sophisticated tools. It provides evidence of a culture that was rich and varied, ingenious and resourceful. In a way, the Nelson Collection is a way of teaching people about Eskimo culture. By working with museums, archaeologists can design shows that give people first-hand knowledge of other cultures by displaying collections of objects. An archaeologist is often thought of as a scientist who spends most of his or her time out in the field, digging up old sites. In fact, the archaeologist usually spends more time at the work of cataloging, studying, and reporting on the objects that are found. An archaeologist is constantly learning by comparing his or her work with the work of others, by pulling together facts that will help us understand our past. An important piece of knowledge may be found at an old site or in a collection made 100 years ago. The work may take place in a tent, an office, a museum, a laboratory, or a classroom. In the future, some of the most important work in archaeology might be done in museums. Just because a collection has been cataloged and displayed doesn't mean that it no longer provides information. In the years to come, many archaeologists may spend their time studying objects like the ones Nelson collected. They will compare those objects with other collections of Eskimo and Indian artifacts from other times and other places. By studying these objects, archaeologists can often trace changes in technology and art that took place thousands of years ago. They can trace influences from other cultures that came through trade and travel long ago. The Nelson Collection, for instance, shows traces of the contacts that the Eskimos of the Bering Sea had with Siberians and with the Athabascan people of interior Alaska. Collections like Nelson's are priceless treasures today. In fact, Nelson's work is among the last of the great collections made from a living culture. In Nelson's time, it was still possible for a single scientist to spend long periods in the field among people who had had little contact with Western culture. Nelson's great assets were his youth, his enthusiasm, and his sensitivity to the people around him. Neither he nor the Smithsonian Institution had much money to pay for the collection, but it was still possible to trade Western goods for the objects of everyday Eskimo life. Today, the Nelson Collection is priceless. No amount of money could ever replace it because much of the knowledge and skill used to make the objects in the collection has been changed. The world is smaller than it was in Nelson's day. Modern transportation and communications have penetrated nearly every culture in the world, and there is virtually no culture that's not affected by outside influence. The endless process of change continues today, just as it did in the world of our ancestors. It's up to us to control that change, to keep the best of the past while accepting the best that the future has in store. The only way to do this is to know the past, to understand it and appreciate it. Archaeology can help us do that. Archaeology can draw us all closer together by teaching us about our own cultural past, by teaching us about other cultures, and by teaching others about us.